Hello there, everyone, and welcome to the 21st episode of the Exploring Antinatalism Podcast, a podcast all about the subject of antinatalism created by anti-natalists. My name is Amanda Oldfan-Sukanik, also known as Forever Wolf Films on YouTube, and today I'm joined once again by co-host Mark J. Maharaj in a conversation with Pro-Mortalist and well-known YouTube-based antinatalist, DailyNegativity. Welcome to Exploring Antinatalism, DailyNegativity. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for being our guest today.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me.
Definitely. And welcome back, Mark. So good to have you back on Exploring Antinatalism. It's been far too long.
It's great to be back. Hello, everyone.
So before we begin properly, I just want to take a moment to highly recommend an interview that DailyNegativity also did on Mark's channel. That's question mark. There'll be a link below. Excellent stuff. So please make sure you also go check that out after this one. So DailyNegativity, let me start out by asking you just some simple basic questions about yourself. In your words, who is DailyNegativity?
I don't want to say too much about myself, but I suppose I'll just say that I'm someone who is interested in ethics, moral philosophy, and who finds the arguments for antinatalism compelling, more compelling than arguments against the view. And as you already mentioned, I have a YouTube channel, DailyNegativity, where I discuss antinatalism, pessimism, suicide, pro-mortalism, and other related issues.
So yeah, you started your channel in 2018, I do believe. And I just wanted to take a moment to say, I really do appreciate sort of the art of your channel, the blank videos, the blank banner, the blank icon. It makes quite a statement all its own. Wouldn't be surprised if you did some visual art or design.
The logo, I mean, it's not really a logo, but the DailyNegativity circle thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's a maroon color.
Yeah, I love that.
Funny. I chose that actually because, Francis Bacon, the painter.
Sure, yeah.
And you might know this about Bacon, but Bacon really hates abstract painting for the most part.
Yeah.
Doesn't like abstract.
Yeah.
And but Rothko produced those paintings with maroon. I don't know if you've seen those.
I've seen them. Yeah, definitely. Okay, fascinating. That's what it's a reference to. Yeah.
And Bacon said these are the most dreadful, dreary paintings I've ever seen. And I thought that's the color. Yeah.
Brown is a massively the pessimism of brown is massively underexplored. I think
Right.
I've long held that thought because it's somewhere in between poop and blood, and it's not black, but it definitely has negative connotations to it.
Right.
But it's also like diners used to be painted brown and orange, so it's like a color that makes you hungry and fills you with desire, but it also has all these negative connotations. So yeah, it's like it was very clear to me looking at your channel, like that it was done with an artistic eye, and so I was like, there's something here. I know it. There's some studied art practice here.
Amazing.
So I knew it.
Why did you put that up?
Do you actively consume antinatalist media? Do you read antinatalist books and such? Are you influenced by both antinatalists of the past or some of the more famous contemporaries?
Right. So I do follow many of the active antinatalists on YouTube. As far as books and written works, I've read Benatar's Better Never Could Have Been, and I've been very influenced by the way Benatar approaches the whole question. But I've not actually read many books specifically on the subject of antinatalism. Most of what I read is in the area of applied ethics, and it's these sorts of books that have, in large part, I think, shaped the way I think about these moral questions, even if I don't ultimately agree with all the conclusions that they reach. So it's the style of thinking, the way in which philosophers attempt to answer moral questions that I think is really valuable, or has been for me.
Right.
And, Benatar's book is, I think, a good example of this, of thinking very clearly about these difficult questions.
I was looking back through your old videos, and I had kind of forgotten that the first time I think I was introduced to your channel was through your video response to my contest, the Why Are You an Antinatalist contest. I think it was in the 2018 edition. And it's a great video. I mean, I was really happy to see that it's actually gotten quite a lot of views since then, about a little over 5,000 views, which is fantastic. Without wishing to make you repeat the video, can you tell us a little bit about why you're an antinatalist and how you became interested in this subject?
Yeah, so just to go back a bit, I started to be interested in philosophy and in particular moral philosophy through issues about non-human animals, veganism.
Okay.
And I started thinking about other ethical issues more seriously. And one of these issues was procreation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are sort of two independent arguments. And one is just this. I think there's far more bad than good in life. So I'm a pessimist in this sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think, and I think we should think, that any act which will predictably result in more bad than good to the individual in question is wrong. It's bad. And so I think creating life is wrong. It's bad. But I also think that even if it were the case that the likelihood of the child or the new being living a bad life were no greater than the likelihood of this being living a good life, I still feel that there's something morally troubling about our imposing this risk on the individual who comes into existence when this being had no need to come into existence. That is to say, they wouldn't have been harmed by not coming into existence. So I suppose I do think there is a kind of asymmetry here between harms and benefits. That is, I think we have a stronger moral reason not to cause harm to others than we do to produce benefits for others. So obviously there are lots of other arguments one might use to defend the view, but these are the ones that I find most compelling.
Some would argue that anti-procreation is split up into, four general schools of thought: child-free, vehement, antinatalism proper, so to speak, and ethilism. Do you have any thoughts on each of those?
Yeah, so I have some time to think about this. And so I think antinatalism and ethilism are very closely connected.
Yeah.
And I think antinatalism may even, some have suggested, right, collapse into ethilism if we define antinatalism in such a way that it's not limited to human reproduction. Though I have to say I have some doubt as to whether the two views would perfectly coincide, even if we did this. As for the child-free movement, it seems to me it's something antinatalists should generally welcome, insofar as one thing it seems to do is combat some of the stigma associated with not reproducing. And I think that's a good thing for antinatalists. And also people not, having children, whatever their reasons for not having children, does at least deliver a good outcome. And then you also mentioned the voluntary human extinction movement. And here again, I'm inclined to think that there are some benefits to this sort of movement for antinatalism. I mean, certainly people who support this movement are not reproducing themselves. Mm-hmm. But insofar as the voluntary human extinction movement very explicitly favors the continued reproduction of other animals, or at least I think it does.
Yes, it does.
It does actually oppose the antinatalist movement as I've just defined it. And so I guess, as far as that goes, I'm somewhat ambivalent.
Yeah, I very much agree with you about the child-free movement, just in that I think they are very good at these, as you said, combating the stigmas and doing more of the social thing that perhaps antinatalism, ethilism is not as good at, but which is very necessary, right. Despite how low we sort of sometimes put that side of it. Okay, so now I'd really like to ask you a little bit about pro-mortalism. You are a self-identified pro-mortalist, if I'm not mistaken. Can I ask you a little bit about how you personally define that term and that position of pro-mortalism?
Yes, so I think this is really important. So pro-mortalism, as I've understood it,
Mhm.
and I think as many others understand it, but is the view that death is good for the one who dies. And notice, it's not a view about the process of dying,
Mhm.
and it's not a view about the overall effects of one's death. Pro-mortalism says that the death of an individual is good in one respect, namely for the one who dies. It's not, however, the view that the death of an individual is good, all things considered, overall good, if you like. And so I think that that is an important distinction.
Mhm. Yeah, the way that it's normally explained to me, let's put it that
Right.
way, is that it has a lot to do with well, how do I say this? The speed at which somebody
Mm.
dies, like that it is best to die now,
Right.
like right this second. Do you
Correct.
think that's a bit of a misinterpretation to apply that
Yes, I
to it?
do.
Okay, okay.
Yes.
Um, does your pro-mortalism come directly, would you say, from Jawoon and his paper on the subject, really, or do you base your pro-mortalism off of other sources as well? I don't personally know very many other people that have written about the subject, so I'd be very curious to know your answer to that.
Yes. So I'd actually not read Juwoon's essay on pro-mortalism.
Oh,
I did
really?
recently.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I recently did.
Hmm.
So I guess you can say I arrived at the view more or less independently, but
Hmm.
if I'm not mistaken, Juwoon coined the term. Is that correct? And I mean, certainly Juwoon was among the first, if not the first, to seriously defend the view.
He's
But I
very
believe,
typically credited with originating it. I don't believe that
yeah.
he is. I think it was present in
Hmm.
a few papers but I wouldn't know the names of who. But he's
Right.
definitely the
Okay.
one that popularized it.
Right. Right. Hmm.
In your opinion, I mean, do you think that David Benatar's asymmetry argument supports the idea of pro-mortalism? Because I know that was a big sort of element
Hmm.
of Jawoon's way of thinking. Do you also agree with that side of what he wrote about?
Right. So I don't think Benatar's asymmetry, and this is, of course, the axiological or value asymmetry.
Right.
I don't think this asymmetry supports promortalism. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, I think one of the interesting features of this asymmetry, Benatar's asymmetry, is that it doesn't have this implication.
Yeah.
Because as I understand it, Benatar's claim is that while the absence of harm is good, even in the case in which no one exists, the absence of benefit, good things, is only bad if there is a being who is deprived of this benefit. In other words, the absence of benefit is bad only once you exist. And so death can be bad on this view, insofar as as far as death deprives existing beings of good things in life. But Benatar also argues that generally the bad things in life outweigh the good things. And this asymmetry, which I think Benatar calls in some places the empirical asymmetry,
Mm.
I think does support promortalism. It supports it. I don't think it implies it or entails it, but I think
Mm-hmm.
it supports it.
Yeah.
But yes, I do think the what Benatar calls the axiological asymmetry does not by itself provide actually any support for promortalism. I mean, I should say that
Yeah.
Juwoon actually does not, again, if I've understood Juwoon's argument correctly, Juwoon's argument is basically that, okay, so Juwoon begins by accepting Benatar's asymmetry
Right. Right.
and then shows that, or argues that Benatar's asymmetry leads to incoherence when you compare lives. Basically, Juwoon says when you compare, okay, so say you have two lives, when you make that comparison before they're born,
Mm-hmm.
Benatar's asymmetry applies, well, what Juwoon says is kind of like a negative utilitarian standard to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're really only giving weight to the harm that's prevented. You're not giving any weight to how good that life's going to be before they're born. But then Jung says, but after they're born, Benatar says there's a symmetry, because the presence of good things is good, and the absence of that, the absence of harm is good, of course, when you exist. But also, I think Benatar would say that the absence of benefit is bad for existing beings. And so there you have a symmetry. And I think what Jung is arguing is that leads to incoherence, because it's possible to say that life A is better than life B before they're born, on Benatar's asymmetry. But once they're born, it's totally possible that you will reverse that, right? Because it's possible that the other life actually has more positive things. And now, since they exist, you have to count those positive things. And I think Jung is saying that leads to incoherence. And so what does Jung do? Well, Jung basically says we should transfer that asymmetry over to cases where individuals exist. And once you do that, then the pro-mortalism, I think, follows. In fact, it's a kind of negative utilitarian view, right? Because if you think about it, negative utilitarianism implies pro-mortalism, as I've defined it. Because certainly, if you're a negative utilitarian, you should think that death is good for the one who dies. Again, you might think dying in all sorts of ways might be bad, and your death might affect others in all sorts of ways. But if all that matters is minimizing pain, I think that view would imply pro-mortalism. And so that's Jung's argument. Jung is not arguing that Benatar's asymmetry implies pro-mortalism. That's what Jung is arguing, I believe.
Yeah, thank you so much for that clarification. I and maybe I'm wrong, actually, but I was under the impression that, by the time he had done his lecture, at the Antinatalism Under Fire conference in, I think it was 2017, that he was sort of making that claim. But perhaps I wasn't there, so perhaps I've misinterpreted that side to his claim. But that was a very good clarification. Mark, do you have anything you want to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in about, I know we've talked about this before, but I still, if you could reiterate exactly your objection to ending it sooner rather than later. If it follows that what's ahead of us is mostly going to be negative, then even if it is a harm to end it because you're going to be deprived of the goods, then doesn't that outweigh all the negatives?
Yes, I think it does. But it wouldn't. It wouldn't imply suicide. It might imply that, I'm perfectly willing to say that earlier death is better than later death for the one who dies. But I just want to make it clear that that's not the same as saying we should end our lives. And that's just because there are other factors to consider.
What are those other factors?
So the effect on others is a big sort of side effect, and also ways of dying. They may be risky, they may be painful. All these things have to be weighed in. And I think what's really important to stress about pro-mortalism is that it doesn't actually take into account all of those other effects and considerations. And so it's not actually pro-suicide or pro-killing.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, the way that you're defining pro-mortalism, like I basically don't have really much of any kind of issue with. I think that my frustration comes from all the different ways that I do think this term is heavily misused, because I've seen it applied to everything at this point, to abortion, to capital punishment, to sentient extinction, red button scenarios. And I just don't know if it's necessarily the best fit. And it might be. I'm not saying, you know what I mean? It's just that I feel like it is often sometimes used as this new sort of strange line in the sand, pejorative term, often between antinatalism and ephilism, if I can be frank. And it's a bit difficult to know what fits the position well in my how I guess my question is, as somebody that does identify as a pro-mortalist, like what are your feelings about all of these different ways that it is misused? You know, when somebody does apply pro-mortalism to abortion, what are your feelings on that?
Right.
Yeah.
I agree with that. And actually, I was thinking about this a little while ago, and I do think the word pro-mortalism is somewhat misleading in that often when we take the position that we are pro something, right, we're saying that we are in favor of pursuing that something. So for instance, if you know, one is pro gun control, well, what this means is that they are in favor of pursuing more restrictive gun laws. And similarly, it's really easy to see how one would assume that pro-mortalism is the view that we should pursue death. And that's actually not the view. And in fact, Jeroen explicitly states in the essay I mentioned that this isn't the view. Jeroen writes, my pro-mortalism, this is Jeroen, my pro-mortalism does not imply that it is obligatory or even permissible to kill other people without their consent, even painlessly and with good intent. And also, if we think back to, you know, the conversation between Sam Harris and David Benatar, when the issue of pro-mortalism was raised, and it was, they made a special point of excluding considerations such as how one's death might affect others, that dying is often, you know, a messy, painful process.
Yeah.
Because they both recognize that these factors need to be bracketed off in order to discuss the subject, which is about death itself for the one who dies. That's really the interesting philosophical question, I think. And so I say all this just to really show that, you know, this is how the term has been understood, I think. Pro-mortalism was never understood by these thinkers as a moral license to kill. But, you know, as you say, some people use it this way. So I think we need to be very clear about what the view is. And in fact, sometimes I sometimes view it as really just an optimistic view of death, that phrase, rather than use the word pro-mortalism, because it does have, you know, it is a bit misleading. But I don't think we necessarily have to abandon the word, but we need to be very clear about what the view actually is.
I think because of all of the somewhat random interpretations of it and the way that people just kind of take it and run with it and do what they will with it, it has become a confused term. But I don't think it needs to be that way. What do you think needs to happen for more people to understand precisely what the pro-mortalist position is correctly?
Yeah, I think we just need to keep defining it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I mean,
Fair
look,
enough.
I do think it's. I now think that it is almost needlessly misleading. It's. But you know, I mean, even saying an optimistic view of death could be misleading. I mean, you know, maybe doesn't capture it quite, but I'm content to just say that we just need to define these things clearly when we talk about them. And I think it's unfortunate that it's been, you know, well, from my point of view, misused, and misunderstood. But at the same time, I can understand that, because again, I do think the name itself is it's a bit misleading. So,
on top of being a pro-mortalist, I mean, do you consider yourself a right to die advocate? Is this something that you want to pursue? In terms of the advocacy of it, sorry. Yeah.
No, I support it for sure. I think, you know, I would support it even if I wasn't a pro-mortalist, right? But I think, yeah, I think generally these are decisions that we should allow individuals to come to for themselves. And that's also true with pro-mortalism, right? I mean, I'm not going to force, I'm not, even if I'm confident that someone's life is not worth living, not worth continuing.
Yeah.
And let's say, even they are suicidal and we think, okay, this is not a life worth continuing.
Yeah. I
still don't think that we should violate the rule, because it's such a useful rule to just say, no. If they are, certainly if they're competent, if they're able to make these decisions for themselves, I think basically, absolutely, we should respect that. Now, obviously, I'm kind of a consequentialist, so I'm not going to say there's never any circumstance in which you can justify that. Yes, but I think it's a very good rule to have, and we should pretty much follow it as though it were absolute.
I think you use the term respecting people's existential orientation. I found that analogy interesting because it fluctuates our orientation, right?
Right.
So, okay, let me expand on that a little bit more. So in that video, you talked about sexual orientation and existential orientation, using that as analogy for if we were to respect, someone coming out as gay, then we should also respect people for coming out and saying that they view life as they view it, right? Like that's their truth, right?
Right.
Do you want to expand on that a little bit more?
Yes. So what I was attempting to do in that video is to draw a parallel between the way we view people who are suicidal and how we not long ago viewed gays and lesbians. And what I think really needs to be challenged is the assumption that anyone who has a desire to take their own life is automatically this is automatically a defective desire that needs to be corrected. I think this is an attitude that we really ought to move away from. So that's what I was mainly arguing there.
I think in that video you were I might be remembering this wrong, but you mentioned how our reaction towards people who have suicidal ideation or wanting to is to give a suicide prevention number and program, and that we ought to have honest conversations about the right to die, and particularly for the individual. I wasn't sure if you were using that as a universal rule, because there are states of being that will be diluted, or they'll be I think delusional, where just as we criticize having a Pollyanna complex, I think someone can have a negative bias towards life that may not constitute their objective reality. And if a therapy or if a therapy is able to help modulate your emotional regulation, then wouldn't we have a duty of care, especially if I'm in care of someone, to say, okay, well, I'm going to call this doctor to help you because something may be wrong. I'm not saying in all cases it's wrong, but I think as a first step, we should really have that preventative measure instead of a quick automatic respect for the right to die.
Right. I think in thinking about this question, it's helpful to consider what I think is an analogous case. So suppose you have a friend who is preparing to, say, go on a dangerous mountain climbing expedition or some other dangerous venture, and you have some doubts about whether your friend really has all the facts that are needed in order to make an informed decision about this. Perhaps, so for example, maybe they aren't really aware of all the possible ways you can die or get injured out there, what percentage of climbers meet a horrible end, whatever it might be. Well, then I think you you ought morally to talk to your friend to ensure that your friend's desire is not just any old desire, but a fully informed desire. In other words, we should make sure that others are acting on desires that not just desires they happen to have, but ones they would have if they were fully informed. But I think once it becomes sufficiently clear that they are informed, they have all the facts, and their desire nevertheless persists, then I think further intervention is generally going to be inappropriate. And I think the situation is roughly the same with suicide.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was trying to get at. Because when I listened to your video, I wasn't sure if you were like, okay, you have this desire, we should automatically be like, okay, here's the way out, or if as a first step to be like, okay, well, let's have the discussion, let's analyze maybe the social conditions in which might be pushing you towards this, and also maybe someone's physiology or whatever. Just as long as there is some type of preventative measure to at least analyze why a person wants to do it, instead of just automatically saying, okay, let's go for it.
Oh, and yes, and I think that would pretty much have to be the case if assisted dying were universally allowed or accessible, then I think we would need those safeguards. We wouldn't, because of course there as a physician or doctor would actually have to be the one to assist the death or to actually administer the lethal drug. And I think people aren't going to be willing to do that unless they're sure that the patient is sure that this is what they want. So yeah, I agree with that. The only thing I worry about is just when, as long as that process doesn't become a sort of endless doubt where you show that you're competent, but still I don't want any bias in it, I guess what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And I think since we live in such a biased world where people are generally optimistic about life, we generally think that life is worth continuing, and I wouldn't want it to we would have to make sure that it didn't have a built-in bias, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, because you can have lots of circumstances, I think, where somebody's being coerced into killing themselves or manipulated in some sort of way. Or you can have a situation where somebody is just, they're hungry. They're you know what I mean? Like they're in some sort of socioeconomic situation that is maybe solvable in some way. And they're forced into a position of wanting to kill themselves. But if they can just fix a fixable problem, maybe they don't have to do that. At the same time, yeah, I do fear the bureaucracy of, all of these different sort of stopping blocks in place that would eventually, that would hinder a person's ability to make a decision as needed, I suppose I would say. Which could have a very negative consequence too, of like it not, proper methods not being provided fast enough in some cases, where someone has then has to resort to using a terrible method, just because they can't get it legally, the way that they need it. So it's complicated. It's definitely complicated, I think. Okay, so I just want to ask you a little bit more about antinatalism. What, in your opinion, does the future of antinatalism look like? Do you see any giant shifts in antinatalist thinking on the horizon? What does the future for this subject look like?
Well, I'm obviously not really well equipped to answer that.
Clairvoyant for antinatalism, yeah.
But I mean, certainly the general interest in antinatalism, I think, is growing, right? I think that's safe to say. And so without being, too or unduly optimistic, I think the general trend is positive. I don't, people differ about this, but I don't, well, I guess I don't know. I don't know what the future holds for antinatalism, but I think the trend is good. I think it's moving in a good direction.
You spoke just a little bit about this before, but I mean, do you consider yourself an antinatalist activism through your videos? And what are your thoughts regarding, antinatalism making any kind of move to, organize properly? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I wouldn't say I'm a very effective activist, but I'm some sort of activist. I mean, one thing I would say is that I really, and I think I said this in with Mark's conversation too, but I really don't spend very much time, honestly, thinking about the activist side of anti-natalism, as much as other anti-natalists do, at least. And I mean, that's not to say I don't think it's important. I do think it's important, but so I don't really have a good answer, I guess, to how we might create an organized movement or anything of that sort. I'd say I spend much more time worrying about philosophical objections to these views rather than the activism side of it.
Yeah, nothing wrong with that. I mean, while I've got what are the philosophical objections that you most worry about?
Well, okay, so I don't know. Well, I don't know if it's a really philosophical objection. I suppose it is. So, for example, for pro-mortalism and antinatalism, because I rest both of those very much on my pessimistic view of life, and I sometimes worry about that because when I talk to people, yes, a lot of people say agree with me, but and agree with the pessimistic view, but a lot of people, they don't. And when somebody just says, I love this, I love being alive, this is great, I would repeat this, now, this is partly why I mentioned the other reason for my antinatalism, which is that for me, the pessimism is one way, right? But there is another way, which is just to say it's just not appropriate morally to impose a risk on someone.
Yeah.
So that even if, I mean, there's a very nice example used by Shana Schifrin, who says, if you imagine a very wealthy person who wants to share their wealth with somebody, with some people on a neighboring island, and the only way they can do this is by dropping blocks of gold. These are heavy blocks of gold. They can hurt and injure people and maybe kill. And the thought is that, well, let's assume too that wealthy can't communicate with these people, so there's no way of getting their consent for this operation. And let's also assume that the people on this island don't need this extra wealth. They don't need it. They're not going to be harmed without it. And wealthy knows this fact. Now, if wealthy goes ahead and drops the blocks of gold on the island, but I'm changing this example slightly, I think. But anyway, if wealthy starts dropping the blocks of gold and trying really hard not to hit people, right? Trying, but some of them might get injured. However, some of them will get the gold, and they'll be quite happy that they did, right? And I'm saying that does not justify wealthy's recklessness.
Right.
The fact that some people will be happy and they'll say, "Oh, I'm so glad that wealthy did this. I see this as a gift. I'm delighted that they made this decision." That, for me, my intuition says no. That does not at all justify wealthy's action. Even if no one was hit by the gold, even if every single person got it safely, right? The risk that wealthy's taking when there's no need to take that risk, I think there's something about that I think is very troubling morally. And so that does not require that one accept the pessimistic view. So that's why I think those two views, it's important to have independent arguments, I think, for these positions.
So I just wanted to use to explore your analogy of leaving a child in the wilderness. Do you remember that?
Yeah, that was one of the earlier videos, I think, but I do remember that. Yeah,
I remember that. Yeah.
For context, it was you were saying that we would look negatively on a parent that would leave their child in the wilderness because of the harms and dangers that they would put it for.
Right.
And that's kind of analogous to bringing a being into existence because there's all these risks and harms. But like the reason we would say a neglect is bad, but if the parent was there with the child, camping, we would say it's not, because there's someone guarding them, being a guardian of them, right? Do you think that analogy still holds up to being brought into existence when the objection is really whether or not we have a responsibility once the person's here to take care of them and to avoid as many harms as possible?
Yeah. Well, I guess what I had in mind is just that no parent can really shelter their child sufficiently, so that those risks aren't present. So it may not, it may not be a perfect analogy, but I still think that when we bring someone into existence, we do place them at risk, and we put them in a state of vulnerability, and I think many of these risks really are not within the control of the parents. They can't control these risks. So in that sense, I think the argument may have some force, but it's not an argument that I use very often. I do talk about antinatalism with people pretty often, and I'd say that's not one of the arguments that I use.
It was an interesting like thought experiment to be like, okay, this is like putting someone out into a dangerous situation, and I definitely do believe that intentionally doing that is definitely problematic.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to say, yeah, I think as long as there is no question that when you bring someone into existence, there is a risk there. I mean, no matter how protective you are of your child, there's going to be risks. And I think, whether it's a convincing argument, I'm not sure, but because I really haven't used that argument with anyone, so I'm not sure. But I do think that the element of risk, I think, is really inherent. I mean, I don't think, parents sometimes like to think that they can control all that, but clearly, you can't. And so,
yeah.
So I don't know. I think it has some force. I'm not sure if it has as much force that as I thought it did when I first put it up.
I think it does have force. I emotionally, I felt, the just knowing, personally, me getting lost and while I'm hiking and feeling that danger and stuff like that, and then imposing that on someone else. Your opinion about the antinatalist community, and I remember you talked about misanthropy within the movement, and that there's like two schools of thought within thinking about that. One is, just not wanting to be around people, being isolated, just not.
Right.
And then the other, I'm not too sure what it was again, but it's kind of like, actually, I don't remember. It was
like ill will? Well, I mean, if you wish evil.
Yeah, wishing ill will, malice on someone else. I don't know. I feel like there might be a variant of that where there tends to be a type of Schadenfreude within some communities of pessimistic thought. I think the charge of that we are just hating on humans is not really valid when you look at our philosophy. But when you look at our public image, or we look at some of the conversation within the community, it sometimes does appear there's a type of Schadenfreude within the community, and I think that might be problematic. And I think that fuels the observation that we're just a bunch of hating people.
Yeah, I think the difficulty with misanthropic arguments that when we characterize humans as beings who cause immense harm and who participate in all sorts of hideous practices, the idea of desert naturally, I think, comes into play, and I think it's quite easy to slide from the condemnation of human behavior and actions to welcoming the destruction and misery of human beings. I mean, of course, these views need not be held together. One can recognize that humans are a very destructive force without thinking that we should be pleased or delighted to see humans suffer. But there is a sense in which I think the one invites the other. So there's a problem for the one making these arguments not to slide into a misanthropic state of that sort. But I think there's also an issue of just how the argument is perceived by others. If we know or have good reason to believe that these arguments will just put off a large number of people, well then, that's something to consider, even if the arguments are sound.
Yeah, if you don't mind me jumping in for just a second, I think there are different, I don't know how else to say it other than sort of categories of misanthropic arguments. Some of which are very, I think, very, very valid, very intellectual. And then there's this other side to it that, more resembles some of what you find in like the child-free world, which is like very about the baby hate and is much more aggressive. And some of that does seep into antinatalism. And it's kind of not doing anybody any favors. At the same time, some of it definitely has its place, in perhaps art or, but it's, it's difficult to know sort of how to, what amount of that is beneficial and what amount of that is a real hindrance, I think sometimes.
Yeah, I think, there's such a diversity of thought within the community. It's just an unfortunate thing, if you ask me. But kind of one of the reasons I kind of have a negative bias towards certain parts of the child-free movement is this. There are, and the thing is, I might, because I haven't really gone into the movement, I might, this might be a superficial analysis of it, just like people have with the anti-natalist group. But I care about children and I care about humans and I care about their suffering. And this idea that when people post how, they hate little kids, it's like, well, it's not their fault they were brought here.
There's a real problem with, which I think some of it's really almost unavoidable with the language, right? I mean, like even pessimism has so many different meanings that it's, people think pessimism means nihilism. People think, and so we really do have to, I think we just need to be clear about what these things mean in the movement, but, words that we can define them however we want, but, the world they're using those words in all sorts of ways. So and even like for example, like the name, DailyNegativity, I've gotten some criticism for that because, negativity, like that's, that sounds like we're just people who are depressed and, we just look at all the bad things and stuff. I mean, I can understand, that criticism, but then again, if I called it daily pessimism, that would also have problems. And then if I just call it daily realism, then you don't really know what it's about. You don't know which side I'm taking. So it just seems it's difficult. And
you can't win.
Well, that's why we're pessimists, right? But yeah, I know, this is
and yeah, I hear you with the nihilism thing too, because a lot of antinatalists are, again, the superficial charges that we're nihilists. And it's like, well, in certain areas, in terms of when it comes to value of suffering and reducing suffering, we're on board for that and we value that.
Yeah.
I mean, the problem is that one way to solve it is to make these words even more complex, right? You just, saying like, like sentiocentric antinatalism. So to avoid the confusion that maybe antinatalism isn't about, all sentient. Well, that's one way to make words more clear. But on the other hand, it makes them less clear because, a lot of people don't even know they've never heard that before. And but I just see it as a kind of, as long as we use language, we need to be aware of those ambiguities in language.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the only way to really combat this is to just keep talking. Like, and that's kind of like, been sort of my my sort of personal mantra, I guess, for this podcast is like, it's an antinatalist internal affairs podcast, essentially. Like, like one of the things that people would say before Mark and others and I created this whole thing was you shouldn't do something like this because you're speaking to the choir, and antinatalism is a circle jerk, and you're always speaking to the choir, and there's no sense in making content for antinatalists. But the fact of the matter is, like, yes, we share a kernel of the same idea, but like we can't agree on anything pretty much, and all of these words do have such divergent meaning from one person to the next. And I just think it's the only thing we have to really sharpen what we're about, really, is to just keep the dialogue going, because I think it is far more diverse than people give it credit for.
Yeah.
And it's far more complicated than people give it credit for. Yeah.
I think another objection to antinatalism in terms of our image or our motivations, and you talked about this, about moral despair, I think is the term. And that on the contrary, we're actually quite morally active, and it's a good thing to have these conversations and spread this information to help others. I just want to say, like, one of the things that I like about your channel, the philosophy that you mention, and you give the a name, and I can reference it, and I just feel like it's philosophically engaging, and it's like bite-sized material, and it's too overwhelming, and I really appreciate that. So I just want to say, thank you for your content, and I'm really excited for your future of on YouTube and whatever else you're going to produce.
Oh, I second that, absolutely. What is the future of the Daily Negativity channel?
Well, if I have something new to say, something that I haven't already said, and that I think is appropriate for the channel, I will make a video. If not, maybe I'll consider doing conversation type videos, or maybe even response videos. I'm not really sure, but most likely I will make more videos in the future.
Excellent. Okay, well, I'm happy to hear about that. So, Daily Negativity, it's been an absolute pleasure to get to speak to you today on Exploring Antinatalism. Thank you so much for being our guest.
Thanks again. It's been a pleasure.
Please visit Daily Negativity's YouTube channel and make sure to subscribe. Link below. And please also check out and subscribe Mark J. Maharaj's YouTube channel, ? Link below. Thank you for listening to the Exploring Antinatalism Podcast. Once again, this has been Old Fan. You can find me at Forever Wolf Films on YouTube, as well as keep up with my daily antinatalist news updates at Antinatal News on Twitter. Please follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and email me at exploringantinatalism@gmail.com. The podcast can be listened to on our YouTube channel, Exploring Antinatalism Podcast, as well as Buzzsprout, Apple Podcasts, and Stitcher. And proudly announcing the official website for the Exploring Antinatalism Podcast, www.exploringantinatalism.com, has been completed, and it is gorgeous. Designed by the amazing Visions Noirs. Please visit Visions Noirs at www.bilenoir.com and check out more of his links below. Podcast artwork donated by the incredible LifeSucks. If you would perhaps like to purchase one of the new Exploring Antinatalism t-shirts by LifeSucks, please visit his Etsy page at www.etsy.com/shop/LifeSucksPublishing. All the best, and bye for now.